Good evening and welcome to this week's episode of QTV, and we have got another fantastic show lined up for you tonight.
We'll be chatting with intersex activist Betsy Driver, whose online services are linking people across the world.
We'll bring you all the action and competitive fun of the Softball Pride Cup.
Graham Willett from the Archives talks about an exciting new project preserving Q+ heritage.
And our Moments in Time series will be looking at the Laird Hotel, pouring beers out loud and proud since 1979.
My name is Betsy Driver. I'm an independent intersex activist in the United States. I've been doing intersex activism since 2001. I started the first online international intersex forum for people with intersex variations to meet each other. It was truly transforming to a lot of people. In fact, that work I did in 2001 gave birth to many of the intersex activists you learn today. The reason I started this organization was because I was struggling with my own intersex variations, having been born in the mid-60s with a body that did not fit into standard medicalized definitions of male or female. Horrible surgeries were done to me as a child, including the complete amputation of my clitoris when I was 8 months old. When I hit my mid-30s, it became a matter of survival. I needed to find somebody else that was like me. And the internet was young, and I thought, I'm going to put something online and see what turns out. It really, truly gave birth to the intersex movement in many ways, as well as brought light to the personal side of our intersex stories. It helps break the shame and the secrecy that so many of us grew up with and the lies we grew up with. And it's not necessarily our parents' lies that we grew up with. However, they were often willing or unwilling accomplices to those lies. They were told by the very doctors they sought out to treat our bodies that we were either the only ones like us, and that we should never tell anybody else about our queer bodies and how we were born. And of course, anytime you have lies in a family, bad things will probably happen over time. And in fact, they do happen, and they still happen. Intersex, it's not nearly as complicated as it seems. On the medical side, it means being born with a body that falls outside of the standard medical or female definitions of what falls into that binary sex designation. You know, the medicalized definition of that is a baby girl is born with a vagina, and when I say baby girl, I mean an XX baby girl is born with a vagina, and an XY baby boy is born with a penis and testicles. However, sometimes you'll have a baby girl that's born with a large clitoris, or you'll have an XY person born looking very physically female at birth because their body does not respond to testosterone. There are also genetic variations. You might have somebody who is XXXY or XXXY. There's several different varieties. It's somewhere, I think, around 30 different varieties of intersex that have been identified so far. Some of them are genetic in nature, some of them are not. Some of them just happen, and they get discovered. Some of the babies born with an intersex variations are identified at birth. Some of them are not identified until puberty. Some of them might not be identified until adulthood, and some people are never identified. They just grow up knowing that they have a body that does not respond like their friends are doing, say through puberty or through young adulthood, and have other issues. Sometimes they'll seek medical care for another problem, and it gets discovered. So there's a lot of different ways that it can be found in nature. From the social side, many of us define intersex not from the medicalized side, because that we find that to be pathologizing, and it makes us a medical oddity. We look at it instead as the lived experience of being born into a body that does not meet society's expectations of what they believe male or female should be. It's important to note that while some people with intersex variations identify as intersex, it's generally not thought of as intersex is generally not thought of as a gender. However, many people do. We identify as male, we identify as female, we identify cisgender, we identify trans, we identify intersex. The one thing, the intersectionality and all that, is that we all were born with a body that fell outside of what was expected. We're gay, we're lesbian, we're bi, we're trans, we're everything in that alphabet that people think about when they think LGBTI, and we're not in that alphabet sometimes, other than the I. It can affect mental health, very much so. And the reason for that is very often the psychosocial side of us are not treated. We're considered to be a medical issue, and our mental health is often ignored. It causes very big problems with people. Many of those problems are, as I mentioned, the shame and the secrets about our bodies and how we were born. Many of us are subjected to surgeries without our consent. You might have somebody with AIS who looks very female at birth but may have gonadal tissue, and that gonadal tissue is often removed under the guise of it being cancerous, or they'll call it a hernia, when it's not. It's actually functioning gonadal tissue that produces hormones that are very healthy for a person. Then they have to take hormones the rest of their life. They have to do hormone replacement. So there's a lot of different issues. The biggest one that we as intersex advocates probably work towards is eliminating non-consensual surgeries done on children, often at an early age. We're not against surgeries. We just believe that the person who owns that body, who is living in that body, should be the person to participate in whether or not that body should be cut to fit standard male or female definitions of what someone's body should look like. As I'm here in Sydney, and I've been attending some of the Mardi Gras events, I took note with both a bit of horror and embarrassment and shame that IVF companies are one of the big sponsors of many of the events here. And in fact, one of them even says in their marketing, creating LGBTI families. Part of the problem with that is intersex variations that can be identified through pre-implementation genetics are often eliminated. Routinely eliminated at the request of the family. We don't want a child with a body that is not standard male or female. There's quite a bit of homophobia and transphobia in that decision because it almost comes down to sex selection in a way as well. It also tells those with intersex variations that their lives are not worthy, that their lives are only worth being eliminated before anything happens in a petri dish. And to take money from an organization that actively does work to eliminate intersex variations, I think is very problematic for any queer organization or any pride organization out there.
Coming up now, the Softball Pride Cup.
Pride Cup started 5 years ago, and it was exactly with this intention. So Jason Ball, who was playing football for Yarra Glen Football Club out in the Yarra Valley, he came out to his team, and it was sort of the worst kept secret within the club, and eventually came out and they decided that they wanted to show that they support him. And so they held the very first Pride Cup out there, essentially, to say, Jason, you can play, we don't care, it's fine. And since then it's spread across multiple sports: softball, water polo, cricket, lawn bowls, so many different sports. And obviously AFL is still one. And it's gone to all different states and territories. And I think this is the first softball one that I know of. I think it is, yeah.
Hey, Maddie. That's it. Let's go, Megs! Yeah, good eyes, Megs. Let's go, Megs! Yeah. Here we go. Let's go, Megs! Yeah, good eyes, Megs. Woo! I'll give you a quick flow. That's what we're playing now? Yeah. My dad's going to bring sausages out and soft while we're playing. Send me one instead. Yeah, go! Go! Yeah! Yeah!
Melbourne Uni itself has been really, really supportive of Pride Cup. They signed the Pride Pledge, which is something that they're asking a lot of sports and sporting organisations and bodies to do, to show that they will be inclusive and stand by inclusive values. And it's been massive, and it's grown really, really quickly. It's now gone outside of Victoria to Queensland, New South Wales, going to South Australia as well. So it's really just a way of showing people that sport is an inclusive place and that they're welcome to play regardless of their gender, their gender identity, their sexual orientation. Whoever you are, you're welcome, and that's really the message that it's trying to send.
Next up, we'll be listening to an interview with Graham Willett that was taking place on Joy 94.9 Saturday Magazine. After that, we're going to take a moment back in time to look at the early days of the Laird Hotel.
Graham Willett from the Australian Gay and Lesbian Archives Association, who's here to talk to us about a very interesting new project that I've actually seen very widely promoted and discussed with many of my friends. It's a project that's actually funded by Heritage Victoria.
It originally came out of during the last state election. Labor promised to do more about LGBTI heritage.
Is that right?
Yeah, it was tucked away in the fine. I mean, not the fine print. It was tucked away in what was quite a long list of promises.
So it was an election promise.
Yeah.
There you go.
Heritage Victoria kind of has carriage of that sort of thing, so they talked to us and came up with some proposals, and then now, so they're now funding us. They've commissioned the archives to go away and do the work to prepare a report on the 100 most significant places and objects for LGBTIQ plus Victorians.
So what you're doing is that you're inviting the community to come up with suggestions, and then you investigate those and document them in some way.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the archives could probably have come up with 100 places and objects just from ourselves and our friends. Although we're really conscious that regional parts of Victoria and some of the suburban parts of Melbourne are likely to be underrepresented. But in any case, we wanted to get people involved in the process because they'll come up with new ideas and different ideas. And it's important to kind of try and draw on that. So essentially, we're asking people to send suggestions. There'll be me and the other project manager from Heritage Victoria will kind of prepare a list. And then there's a kind of an advisory committee to look over that and help us make the final decisions.
So the final product will be a report that lists the 100 top listed events, places or objects?
Places and objects, but
places
not
and
events.
Objects, not
so
events.
The thing
I
about
apologise.
heritage I discovered early on is it's not the same as history. So history includes events and people.
Right.
Heritage is confined to places and objects.
Objects are fascinating. The idea of objects are fascinating. So presumably people are coming. I think the call is for people to come forward with some ideas of what sorts of objects have been put forward.
Give us some examples.
It varies a lot.
Some interesting ones.
One of the early ones that came up was a badge produced in 1979 that read, "We're not all straight in the Garden State." Now,
I remember those.
I was going to say, you have to be a certain age to remember what the Garden State meant.
In fact, I remember seeing people at uni wear those.
Yes, I found
and
mine.
thinking, what the hell?
And then there's stuff going, the archives has, for example, a little handwritten book of poetry sent from one man to another man. To my friend from his friend. This is from 1920s. My friend to his friend is coded language for homosexuality in the 20s, which somebody found in a second-hand bookshop.
Wow.
Went, hello, I know what this is, and ended up giving it to the archives.
So we haven't got
after.
the pool table from the Glass House Hotel in the...
Look, honestly, we're open to all sorts of suggestions. The only thing is they have
Black
to still...
plastic from Shed 14 at a red ball park.
Shed 14 is on the list.
Now you're talking.
The only criterion really for the first long list is that they have to still exist. So there are places that people remember very fondly. For example, Val's Coffee Shop in Swanson Street, it's now a vegetarian restaurant, but the building is still there, so that counts. We can put Val's Coffee Shop in.
Right.
Whereas something that had been torn down, has Shed 14 fallen down yet?
No, I think it's on its way.
I'm
sure there's no black plastic left.
Oh, there'll be somebody will have some as a souvenir. There's the big, obviously iconic places, things like Parliament, St Patrick's Cathedral, places that have shaped queer life with their laws or their attitudes or whatever. And that'll be included. The city baths where people used to, quote unquote, hang out and pick each other up. So there's kind of big iconic places.
No. At the pool?
At a pool, never.
No.
Or a
it's
beach.
Amazing, isn't
How
it?
would that happen?
Port Melbourne Beach.
I think the St Kilda baths are gone. We've got some great photos from that period. So the buildings can be those kind of places, but they can also be places like the Prince of Wales or Club 80 or the Pier and places like that. As you say, the Glass House has a kind of long history of association with lesbianism and the recurring attempts to get bars started and going. And certainly I think that I can't think why that wouldn't be on the list, really.
Make sure someone puts it forward.
Oh, we can put stuff out. Part of the advantage of an advisory committee is that somebody can say, hey, wait, we've forgotten this. Because people are pushing forward really lots of really good ideas.
And I guess the challenge then is to work out what the top 100 is. So what sort of criteria or how do you do that?
Well, they have to still exist. That's part of one of, have to be physically
still there.
Yeah, still there. There's also then we want to make sure we've kind of covered Melbourne, the suburbs, the regional parts of the state. So that will be important.
So you're getting many from the country?
We're getting a few, actually. We've had Warrnambool sent us a list of 4 possibilities the other day.
Wow.
We'll probably go and visit. Ballarat has a good queer history group. And they've already given us a few suggestions.
So is are you looking for the sorts of things that have helped define us as a LGBTIQ community here in Melbourne and Victoria?
That's certainly true. But in fact, there's stuff that we didn't know about or, was only tucked away in the archives. Like we've got this lovely set of love letters from one man to another man from the 1920s, which a friend of ours found in the Public Records Office. They were in the criminal file of one of these men who was arrested for the relationship. And they're just beautiful letters. And you couldn't actually argue they'd shaped Victorian life at all. They were just 2 letters, I think 2 letters, between 2 men. One of whom got arrested, charged, and they kept this stuff. So sometimes there's the history out there that we don't know about, and we're keen to capture that and roll it in as well. For most of its history, Melbourne has been divided by the Yarra River. North and south had very different kind of cultures and communities. And so when the gay community started to emerge in the 1970s, this was as true for them as it was for the rest of the city. South of the river, Commercial Road and Chapel Street had been welcoming camp women and men at least as early as the 1960s. North of the river, things came later, with the emergence of Northside, as it was called, in the 1980s. Although even there, of course, it's possible to find places that were welcoming of gay people and before that camp people, before the 1980s as well. The real starting point for Northside came in 1980 when an old pub in Collingwood, known as the Laird of Cockpen, relaunched itself as a place open for gay men. In those days, its men-only policy couldn't actually be enforced, and at one point a group of gay radicals took a lesbian friend with them in order to have her thrown out so that we could all be suitably outraged. By the late 1980s, anti-discrimination laws were in place, and it was in fact possible to get an exemption from those laws in order to become a men-only pub, and that's what the Laird did. It was men only, it was for masculine men, no disco, no drag, and it was also a place where eventually bears and leather and fetish became an important part of the scene. In all of this, it was wildly successful. The Laird became very popular and was known to be the kind of place where people could go to relax and have a quiet beer if they wanted to. It became a central part of Melbourne's gay community and took on sponsorship of a bunch of different organisations. It also provided a model for this kind of pub, and Circuit these days operates very similarly. The Laird was really at the centre of the Northside experience. There was the Glass House, which was a women's only pub at various points in its existence. There was Hares and Hyenas, the queer bookshop and events centre, as well as various cafes and restaurants that popped up and disappeared with rapidity. Northside remains a culture in a way that Southside really hasn't, and partly that relates to the way in which people who live there are felt to be a different kind of gay and lesbian person. More serious, less trizzy. Whether that's true or not, Northside remains an important part of Melbourne's queer life.
What a great institution for our queer plus community, especially the male members. Such a historic, iconic institution, and it's done so much for our community. That's a wrap from us tonight. We hope you enjoyed the show as much as we enjoyed bringing it to you. Stay tuned next week for another great episode of QTV. Good night.